Welcome back to the Hardware Unboxed podcast for episode 101. We are going to be talking about DLSS 5 in this podcast, our initial impressions based on what Nvidia has shown off so far. Obviously, a lot of people have been asking us for our thoughts on this technology. Been a bit busy with Crimson Desert, so we're going to get into that in this week's episode. On top of that, a few additional thoughts on Crimson Desert. So if you're interested in that particular game, some of the technical side of things and our initial thoughts on testing it and playing it, we'll be discussing that title. So let's get into it. So we'll start off today's podcast with the very, very hot topic that is NVIDIA's new DLSS 5 technology, which I don't really know how to describe this best. So I'll just use Jensen's words for this one. He describes it as content control generative AI processing at the geometry level. So that's paraphrasing some of his statements.
I know exactly what you mean now. Excellent.
So obviously most people watching this podcast have seen NVIDIA's DLSS 5 announcement. There's been some heated reactions to this, some quite divisive reactions as well. And so we thought we'll come on the podcast and give our impressions on this particular technology, at least based on what NVIDIA has shown so far. Obviously, we do not have hands-on with this technology. It's not released. It's coming later this year, supposedly. So this is just based on NVIDIA's demonstration that they showed at their press event earlier this week. Now, some people wondered, why haven't we published a video on Hardware Unboxed about this? We were busy covering Crimson Desert, which we'll also probably talk about a bit later in this video as well. I think, Steve, you were a little sick for parts of this week, so the podcast it is if you want our full thoughts. So I guess I'll just start with my initial impressions of DLSS 5 based on what NVIDIA has shown. I think, like with a lot of AI-based technology, it's technically interesting. So the way that they're implementing this technology, the way that it works, at least from that standpoint, seems interesting to me, that they're taking graphics technology in this direction. It's something that we haven't really seen before. So all of that side of things is interesting because I'm always interested in new technology for games and that sort of thing, whether it's good, bad, or whatever. I think my reactions to the image quality that NVIDIA sort of showed in their presentation, I thought it generally looked bad across most of the images that I saw. I'm not quite sure why NVIDIA showed these specific images to show off the technology. I think that kind of backfired on them, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that later. But I think generally the output that they showed made things, I wouldn't say look worse necessarily, but look different in a way that I wasn't a fan of. So things like the changes to the face of Grace in Resident Evil, I thought it made her look like a different person in a way that, sort of had the vibes of AI slop or Instagram filters, sort of Facebook memes that people have sometimes shared that are AI generated. It had that kind of look, which is I'm not a huge fan of that type of look, the AI look. I felt that that image from Resident Evil and some of the other examples as well sort of had that I guess visual style to it. And then the changes to the environment, I thought this was probably a bit more acceptable outside of the faces, but I still felt like what they showed in games like, I think it was Oblivion Remastered, Assassin's Creed Shadows, it reminded me of those sort of YouTube videos showing off like hyper real edits of games or like reshade mods where they crank the contrast and lighting up to maximum, as opposed to more sort of what I would say is a realistic, like how I think the developers would have gone for realism in those games. And it did kind of make some of the games look a bit samey in the way that it handles some of the reflections and things. Like it made Assassin's Creed Shadows look really bright, for example. It kind of made the same look from Oblivion as well. And those two games have quite different styles when you're playing them. So it kind of gave this sort of samey feel, which, we've been through this whole Unreal Engine 5 era where, I think people are starting to recognize that style of game. Like Unreal Engine 5 gives games a style, and that can sometimes feel a bit samey. I got the same impressions from this as well. So that's just based on, the sorts of visuals that I saw. I wasn't like when I see things like DLSS 4 technology or whatever, I'm like, okay, I'm pretty on board with this. This looks reasonable. With DLSS 5, I sort of got more, like AI slop vibes. And then there's obviously the whole technical angle that we'll get into, the needing it to run on two RTX 5090s. What does this mean for performance and VRAM in games in the future? But yeah, my impressions, I think, were largely negative, I would say, based on what they showed. What did you think of what they had shown off?
Well, I think, like you said, I think it's, what was the word? It's like interesting, technically impressive, I thought. I don't know. My initial impressions of what they were showing were probably different to most people's, I don't know, reaction or just their takeaway from it. I wasn't as outraged or as upset about it as most people. And maybe that's surprising given that initially not a fan of ray tracing. Still think to this day ray tracing has been heavily underwhelming based on what we were sold, especially with, obviously the 20 series. DLSS upscaling, initial iteration of that was terrible, really bad. They sort of had to go back to the drawing board, rethink it, come back with DLSS 2.0, which was much better. So, we were critical of that initially, but that's gotten better over time. It's still not something I rave about, or, it's definitely one of the key features in a Radeon versus GeForce battle when things are close. So I think having better support and, that's an advantage. Stuff like frame generation, obviously I've been much more critical of that than you have. Not really a fan of that technology. But at the same time, I'm not outraged or upset by it. And I think that's kind of the same thing with DLSS 5. I don't like how a lot of these features get weaponized, and maybe that's a concern for something like a DLSS 5, for example, yet to be seen, but that's always a concern with Nvidia because they absolutely did that with frame generation, and I think that's the biggest sticking point for you and I with frame generation, right? Neither of us are, where it's kind of like a feature where we're happy enough for it to exist. You can use it if you want to use it. If you like it, that's fantastic. If you don't like it, you don't have to use it. That's kind of frame generation in a nutshell, except then it's used to be weaponized by the marketing team and CEOs to say ridiculous things like, 50/70 equals 40/90 when that couldn't be further from the truth. So keeping all that in mind, you probably, because some people think I've been really, I hate ray tracing. I've crapped on DLSS. I think frame generation's garbage. So I'm just going to hate DLSS 5. But I was watching it and I was just genuinely intrigued and interested and thought, okay, there's endless possibilities here. Yeah, some of the examples weren't great and I certainly didn't like, but there were other ones that I genuinely just thought it looked a lot better. Like, what were your thoughts on Starfield, for example? Maybe I'm an idiot, but I was sitting there thinking, these characters definitely look better. Like, this is a huge upgrade to the game. If this was released as some sort of like texture pack, like remastered version of Starfield, I think people would be raving about it. If you remove the AI from it and how they've actually achieved it, I think if that was a remastered version of Starfield, people would be just blown away. It addresses one of the bigger problems with that game. But what are your thoughts on that, for example?
Yeah, I think the Starfield example is probably one of the better examples in terms of the face rendering side of things. Mm-hmm. I feel that's largely because Starfield looks pretty bad. Like, when it came out, I wasn't a fan of how it looked visually. Not just the faces, which are obviously bad in my opinion, but the whole game. I feel like that the style, everything in that game didn't really work for me. So to have a system that can sort of take the faces that, in my opinion, looked bad in that game and change them in the way that DLSS 5 has changed them, that is certainly impressive. That it didn't require additional, like developers to go in, change the geometry of the faces, relight them, improve the textures. It just uses AI to do that. But at the same time, it's sort of like it changed it, but it made it, it's just not quite as good as I would have hoped if the system was working correctly. Like, to have a system that can do that, but make it look really photoreal and excellent, I would have gone, wow, that's like incredible. But to me, it felt like they had essentially just slapped AI-generated faces onto the top of the Starfield models. And I guess you could argue that that is an improvement because the models originally were bad. Mm-hmm. I wasn't like wowed, I guess, by it. I was like, I can see what they're doing here and it looks okay, I guess. Is it a pure improvement? It depends whether the final version, to me, whether it has that AI look or whether it doesn't have that AI look. If they can make it not look as AI as it looked in the demo, I think that would be a really significant achievement. If it still has that sort of feeling of like, they've just superimposed faces on top of the models, maybe not so much. And I feel like the still images are perhaps an even better example than the video samples that they sort of showed in motion, where you sort of get that AI face on top of the models, but then the animation of the models is still the Starfield animation.
Mm.
So that almost to me created this kind of uncanny valley where they'd used, the detail in the model or whatever is maybe subjectively better, but it doesn't mesh well with the animation the game has. So it sort of had that disjointed feel to me.
That's fair.
But yeah, I can certainly understand why you would look at that game and sort of say, yeah, that is a better looking face because the faces were bad in that game to begin with. But then if I contrast that with, I've already mentioned Grace from Resident Evil, which I think generally looked worse and just like a different person, or some of the Hogwarts Legacy examples.
I think they were some of the better examples of it not being great, just because that game has a specific art style and it's not meant to be photorealistic. So it didn't really make sense to use that specific game, whereas I think, Starfield's probably a better example.
Yeah, Resident Evil, it felt like they just cranked up the filter to like 11 and it just ended up changing the model. I mean, people have sort of done, they've superimposed the DLSS 5 image directly over the non-DLSS 5 image to sort of show, hey, it is the same underlying model, but there's new lighting here or whatever to change how it looks. Whatever the technical realities of how it works are, I still think the face in that example looked different to me, like a different person. So from that sense, that's why I thought it looked bad. And then the Hogwarts Legacy example, I think they changed the main character in that game is a child, and it sort of made it kind of look like a middle-aged man, which I thought was again like maybe just applying the filter indiscriminately, like they're not really thinking about what was that character in the game and how do we use this to enhance the lighting for that character. They're just like, hit the Gen AI button, out comes the result, and it just turns out that it made the character middle-aged, which is certainly not the case playing that game. So I think the faces is, that needs work. Like if we're going to be like ignoring the whole is generative AI bad or not sort of angle, from a do I like this visual output angle, it needs a lot more work than what they showed in the faces to make them more realistic, less uncanny valley, and not to have that AI look, which I guess I didn't like.
Yeah, and I guess that's fair. And maybe Nvidia would be sitting here scratching their head going, well, yeah, it's an early demo. So like it's not a final product. It's room for improvement. You can tune things. This was just an early presentation because we're excited about the technology and we thought you guys would be as well. And again, I'm not defending Nvidia here or anything. I just feel like all of those things are fair. Like the Assassin's Creed Shadows example, I actually agree. I think the game looked much worse with DLSS 5 in pretty much all of the examples shown. Way too bright. It was like one of those cheap fake HDR type filter things. Didn't like that. There were some scenes in Oblivion that gave me the same vibes, but then there were some other scenes that did look really good, I thought. So I was mixed on that one. And then even the world in Starfield, I thought looked a bit odd at times. It was a bit, too filtered and looked too different. But I did like, from what I saw, I preferred the characters there. But I guess I was also watching it thinking, okay, how much better is this going to get? And if this is, whenever I look at this stuff, there's a heap of things going on in my head. First of all, I'm like, okay, so this is an Nvidia showcase, probably a best case scenario of what they have now. So keep that in mind. But also it is an early preview. And if we think back to things like DLSS that were just an abomination when they were released, and then people may still argue that now, I think that's probably a bit unfair. You and I are quite impressed with what they've been able to achieve with DLSS. So that's certainly improved. And, they could probably do the same with this. I don't know. I guess if you ask for my thoughts, looking at it back now, I'm kind of numb to it all. Like I wasn't too strongly opinionated in one direction or the other. I was like, this is pretty neat. This is impressive. I don't know if I'm excited about the direction we're going in. Like to date, I haven't been super wrapped with how we've gone since like the GeForce 20 series. But I'm not, I don't know, I'm not extremely upset about this. I just, Yeah, and I don't know. I watched the Digital Foundry video twice because I watched it when because I wasn't aware of the video. I was neck deep in Crimson Desert, back-to-back benchmark. So I was doing all of that, not really paying attention to what else was happening in the world. And then I caught wind of your tweets and was chatting with you back and forth about it. And I went and watched the Digital Foundry video probably before it got super heated and negative. And I watched their video and I thought it was, dare I say it, sort of reasonable enough. I didn't see anything to be terribly outraged about with their video. It's like when we go to Computex, right, and we cover MSI. We're not reviewing MSI products. We're going to a tech trade show, potentially to see tech demos or early access to new products without any real testing or whatever. And it's just like, here's some upcoming stuff. It's not buying advice. It's just, this is what's in the pipeline. Looks pretty exciting. Can't wait to test it to see if it actually is exciting or not. And I watched the Digital Foundry content with the same understanding. I see these guys who are very passionate about that sort of stuff. And I guess that's where there's some difference between our opinions and Digital Foundry's with the actual product, because they tend to get more excited about the technologies and review them rather than the product. And I could be wrong about that. I haven't watched tons of their content, but that's the impression I've got over the years when we have sort of overlapping content. We're more critical of the overall product, whereas they get more invested in what the product could do. So that's probably a difference between our two channels. They're more excited about that technology. But anyway, I just felt bad for the guys at Digital Foundry in this specific example. So I went back today and watched the original video from them again, just with a new understanding of how everyone or how a large amount of people seem to accept their video. And I don't know. I went back and I watched it again, and it seemed, I don't even know what to say, Tim. Like, I was like, I don't really know where the outrage is here. These guys just went and saw the tech demo. They described what they saw. It all seemed reasonable. Sounds like they're walking it back now and saying that they didn't read the room or predict to read the room or whatever. I would have just stood my ground on that and been like, I don't know what we did that was so bad here. Like, we went and checked out the technology. They weren't recommending race out and buy 25090s because this is going to be amazing. If anything, they were sort of like, this looks technically good. It's a jump in graphics. It's pretty impressive, but it is running on 25090s. And while Nvidia says they'll be able to improve that, we're somewhat skeptical. Like, we'll see where this goes. But as a tech demo, as a showcase, it's pretty interesting, pretty exciting stuff. I don't know. What did you think of all of that? Am I insane?
In terms of the Digital Foundry video, I mean, I think they said they got death threats, which I always think is completely over the top for these sorts of scenarios. Yeah. I mean, they're just sharing their opinion. A difference of opinion, I don't think, is anything to get super heated about. I think this is especially heated because it has that AI angle. So people are sort of working in the whole hate for AI, what it's done to making gaming hardware expensive, that whole side of things. Mm-hmm. People have a lot of ethical concerns with generative AI specifically. Mm-hmm. And so they're applying that to sort of this whole thing. If this was the same technology with the same bad output, but it sort of did it in a way that wasn't AI related, mm-hmm. I think you would see the reaction to Digital Foundry's video and this whole thing being pretty different just from that sense. So yeah, I mean, I feel like when people are just sort of offering their opinions and there's sort of a difference of opinion, especially when they're not necessarily reviewing the technology, as you pointed out, it's not anything to get super crazy over. Mm-hmm. I certainly do at the same time understand people's opinions when they say that it looks like the DLSS 5 output looks awful and how could you come to a different conclusion? I think we're trying to be in this podcast quite balanced about how things are with the technology and not just going crazy about it, but certainly, the way the internet works these days, it's everything is so polarized. It's either amazing, next generation, crazy good technology, or it's complete garbage that needs to go in the bin and sucks and we need to burn this with fire and I don't know, like do bad things to everyone that says it's good. So that's the state of the internet today. And there's no room anymore for sort of positions to be in the middle. And I'm not saying like I overall, I have a relatively negative opinion about this technology. But even some of the things I've seen related to this, I think, have definitely gone really far. And I think my position is sort of more coming from it as in, I'm not yet convinced that what they've shown with DLSS 5 and the issues that I have with it can be solved with current generative AI technology, because I feel like a lot of other generative AI tools also create this AI look.
Mm-hmm.
And so NVIDIA's got a big challenge here to sort of prove that they can make this technology not look like that. And certainly they haven't shown any examples so far that I would say don't have that look. And I think if they had showed some sort of AI enhancing technology for games that didn't have the AI look but worked in a largely similar way, I think the reaction would be very, very different, because it appears to me that, we did a poll, for example. I think 80% of people said that they thought it made games look worse. That was a sample size of about 25,000 plus people. And so if it didn't have that AI look, I think those sorts of polls would be very different, and the whole opinion of it would be more related to things like maybe the concerns around generative AI and how it's trained, for example, as opposed to just the output. But I think, the output as it stands right now, I wasn't like excited about it, if you know what I mean. Like you were sort of suggesting, like, looking at it just from this is interesting technically, but we haven't sort of reviewed it or anything. To me, this is sort of in the category of technologies like maybe NVIDIA Ansel or RTX Remix, or those tools where, you can filter games and apply things to them to sort of improve the visuals. But it's not something I'm like, whoa, I'm going to be raving about this until they prove that it can do some of the things that they're sort of claiming it can do, avoiding uncanny valley, again, the AI look sort of thing, and sort of how do they handle this sort of hyper realistic visuals that they're going for. So yeah, that's sort of, I guess, my thoughts on the artistic side of things. I mean, they've sort of claimed as well that, developers have full artistic control over the output. It's really hard with these scenarios because they're clearly applying it to games that are already released. So people know what a game like Assassin's Creed Shadows looks like, or they know what a game like Resident Evil Requiem looks like. And when you drastically change that look, it's really messing with people's perception of what that game was in their mind, what the characters look like. Is there going to be a future where, we don't have that preconceived idea of what the games look like? And so maybe the DLSS 5 output is more acceptable from that sense. I'm not sure. But yeah, that's certainly something that NVIDIA, they need to not just say that developers have control over how it outputs images, but prove that it can create sort of more natural looking examples, in my opinion.
Yeah, I get the AI slop, like the AI look. I get the concerns there and everything. I guess with the Starfield example, which probably impressed me the most, is because I've been playing computer games for forever now. I turned 43 this year. I've been playing them for most of my life, and I've seen all my favorite video game characters change significantly in their appearance as graphics have improved, and they've changed in ways that I didn't necessarily expect. Like, characters sort of almost transformed and changed as we went through the generations. So to me, it's like I'm not married to the idea of one specific look of a character because they've changed so much. Like, you go back 20 years when I probably did a lot more gaming, and you look at all the characters in those games that are still exist today, and they're vastly different. So I'm not, I'm not as, I don't know, sensitive to those sort of things changing a bit if it does look better. But yeah, again, I get that there's the whole AI look and all that, which people don't particularly like. So
yeah, I 100% agree with you on that in terms of, the look of games do change. I think we even saw an example of, I bring up like a Spider-Man, for example. They did change. They actually, in that game, changed the main character's look with a patch. Like, they physically, when they did the remaster, the character came out, and I think they just changed the model that they were using for Spider-Man. So that has happened in the past. No, I'm not against developers having the ability to change the way characters look or improve them over time. My only concern is just that the output, in my opinion, is just not that good. So it's up to, like I sort of said, if NVIDIA can make this system work really well, then I think a lot of those concerns would just go away. Like they're not going to be problematic. I think people, if you sort of saw the Resident Evil Grace example again, like if that was just a quite close replica of the character, maybe it was changed a little bit, but it didn't have that sort of like added makeup sort of look and sort of change the way that she was lit from the front look, I think people would have had, again, like a very different opinion, even if the character ultimately did look a bit different. If it looked more realistic but of a different person, sure. But I think that the main issue was, again, the generative AI look to it. And so, yeah, I do have concerns about how does the system work, for example? Like, will developers be able to, I don't know, like, is it a system where it just takes the image from the game and you get the output that you get? Or can you sort of say, no, I didn't want that face. Can you generate a different face or something along those lines? It's not really clear how that works. But certainly, I don't really fall into the category of being super concerned with like this sort of, how's it been described, like artistic vision of games. Developers ultimately, if they choose to implement this feature, that is sort of saying that is the artistic vision that they want, because games do have different settings. You don't have to play Resident Evil Requiem with path tracing. You can use it without ray tracing as well. Mm-hmm. And both of those are the quote unquote artistic vision or style that the developers wanted, because the developers gave you those features in the game. So any developer that integrates DLSS 5 into their title is sort of saying that is the style that they wanted, because they're giving you the option to use it. So from that sense, I'm not like overly protective of games. I'm not like, developers should not be integrating this because it'll change the look of the game. If developers like the look of what DLSS 5 produces, who am I to say that they're wrong? Because ultimately they're creating the game. It's their choice. Mm-hmm. I would hope that choice is put onto the artists in the game and not upper management. So the people creating the character models should probably have the say over whether they like the DLSS 5 output or not. But to me, as a gamer, I'm still allowed to sort of say at the end of the day, you made the artistic choice to use DLSS 5, but I don't like how it looks. So that's my opinion. There's nothing really you can do about that.
Based on my understanding, is it's also an optional option.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Like it is optional to play the game using ultra, high, medium, low. All of those settings typically change the character's appearance, usually quite substantially. So, like if you're not playing an ultra, are you not playing the way, the game in the way that it was meant to be presented? In some ways, that's probably true, but I mean, you got to work with what you've got. My concerns would be more things like consistency, because that's a huge problem with generative AI, massive problem. Like, I will be surprised if characters look the same or, very, very similar throughout the game using this technology based on how we've seen it working. So yeah, consistency would be one of the bigger concerns I've got. But then, I mean, there's so much that's yet to be seen. Like we're getting way ahead of ourselves on this one. Like, who is this technology for? Who's going to be able to use it? Like, what are the hardware requirements? What's the chances this is going to work in any capacity on an 8GB graphics card?
Oh, none. Absolutely none. So,
like, how much VRAM does it need? Is it going to work on a 12GB card? Like, is this something you'll be able to use in any capacity on a 5070?
So, yeah, I mean, moving into that, outside of the sort of artistic side of things, the fact that they had to run this on an entirely separate 5090, I think, does throw into question the ability to run the model and the game at the same time, especially if VRAM is more of an issue. Because let's say, for example, that it used even just 16 gigabytes of VRAM or something to run the model, you're pretty much going to need a 5090 to run that in any game, just because some games can use easily these days 12 to 16 gigs. So if you need another 16 gig for the AI model DLSS 5 thing, I mean, that eliminates the vast majority of NVIDIA's GPUs.
Even if it requires 4 gigabytes of VRAM,
that's right.
That's going to be a struggle on 12 gigabyte cards for sure. Basically not possible, because that turns them into 8 gigabyte cards. And yeah, 16 would be, again, the bare minimum, which is what we've been saying all along. So I know that's an interesting aspect of it as well.
And it's on top of that, the performance of running the model on top of the game. Like, what does that do to the performance and especially the latency of the game? Because a lot of rendering technologies, they're applied to at the exact moment that the game is being rendered, this appears to be sort of rendering the game and then running an additional pass over the top. And if that pass is extremely expensive, does that mean the game is running much slower than it was previously? Is it buffering frames or doing something like that? I don't know. So again, there's a lot of questions there, but it seems like...
Well, it's extremely advanced / powerful post-processing. So there's going to be some serious overhead associated with that for sure.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, Nvidia says that they want this to run on a single GPU later this year when they release it for people in the fall or / spring for us in Australia. I mean, yeah, that's a challenge. I'm not 100% sure how they'll do that. And then on top of that, is what they're showing today going to be downgraded to actually work on a single GPU? That's another concern because they have the entire power of a second RTX 5090 to run what they're currently showing. And again, in my opinion, it currently doesn't produce images that I think are overly impressive in a lot of scenarios. So is it going to be, like I'm saying, the model has to get better to impress me.
And use less than half of the compute power.
That's right. They're going to have to simplify the model to get it to run on a single GPU, at least a single GPU that is available today. And maybe they're sort of thinking this more as a technology for future generations. I'm sure that's what they're thinking. But I mean, pretty ambitious to try and, optimize this sort of model. And I know things can be optimized, but we're talking about something that, really hasn't... If you look at like video generation models, even those running in the cloud on extremely powerful hardware, those still do not produce particularly impressive outputs. And so to be able to run the entire game and then a model that's doing all this processing on a single GPU that you can have in your house, well, I don't know. I'm very skeptical of that.
Yeah, it'd have to be wildly inefficient at this point of the development. And how they're going to get it from that to something they can ship where it'll work on mid-range graphics cards this year. I mean, if they can do it, that's incredible. We'll have to see on that one. But they're more of the things I'm concerned about is actually, how relevant is this technology to begin with? Like, who's going to actually be able to use it? And then how usable is it going to be with stuff like consistency and that, like forgetting about just the image quality and stuff like that to begin with, like with what we've seen, just how good a job does it do of maintaining that throughout the game? Or do you keep, does the main character become 10 different people throughout the game?
Yeah, that's what I'm really interested to know as well. I saw some of the footage that people had taken of the demos that were actually at whatever Nvidia's conference is called, GTC. I think there's GDC and GTC, and I always get them confused. I think it's GTC's Nvidia's one.
Yep.
I saw some videos that people had taken of this screen, and the demos did seem to be pretty controlled. There were certainly movements that I would have liked to do if I had control of it that I didn't see being done. So, for example, fast camera movements, panning around and sort of moving away and then moving the scene back to the same scene to see whether it looks the same. The characters were sort of shown, here's a character, let's turn it on and off and have a look. But if you sort of got that character in a different lighting environment, is that character going to look the same? There's no real examples of that. And then there was pretty significant like temporal issues that I saw just in the slow motion sort of scenes that they had. Like, I think there was one Starfield example I saw where a character sort of moved in front of the screen and you got what I would describe as ghosting, like massive amounts of ghosting as the reflections were sort of being generated again over time and that sort of thing. And so that is going to be a big backward step if that is the image quality that is given to people in the final version, because NVIDIA's worked so hard over the years improving the temporal stability of games through things like DLSS 4 versus 3 and then 4.5 versus 4 to then go backwards in terms of ghosting stability with this AI version would be really, really disappointing, because I think those artifacts are things that people are becoming less tolerant of over time. The sort of TAA blurs being talked about a lot over the years, sizzling, things like that with FSR. If we're getting AI generated lighting, but then it's really unstable. And another issue with it is, as well, as that it seems largely screen space. So it's only really looking at the lighting elements that are physically on screen. So potentially if you look at different angles and the AI model is seeing different light sources, it's going to generate different lighting, which will mean that the lighting quality is going to be very inconsistent as you move around. Those are all very, very significant challenges. And I personally would not be interested in playing a game where, you walk around and the image is just like generating random stuff all the time. The noise, temporal issues are significant. And then, lighting sources don't really make sense. I find it, I guess the way I sort of put it is maybe like, I find it interesting that a lot of the graphical advancements up to this point have been more simulation type of things, like path tracing, ray tracing. They're trying to make GPUs more powerful so that we can simulate realistic lighting. Like we'll do the physics calculations. We'll make sure the bounces are all accurate. And we're trying to get this natural simulated look. And now NVIDIA is talking about this next generation feature being more of like an elaborate guessing system. Like instead of simulating the lighting, they're now saying, well, we'll take the image and we'll sort of guess what the lights should be doing. We'll sort of guess that this should look like this. And I think that's what you sort of saw with some of those Assassin's Creed examples in the environments where it's no longer simulating what it should have looked like. It's just going, oh, okay, well, we're guessing that should look like that. And that scene should look more shiny. So that's a good guess. Let's implement that. I don't know if I want that to be part of games. Like I'm more interested in, I guess, simulating things over time instead of guessing them. And then on top of that as well, the whole, this is only affecting visuals. It's not going to be doing things like physics simulations. It's not going to be improving animation. And so if you're putting this sort of guessed lighting on top of these systems, is it going to give that truly realistic look if things like the physics simulations are still the stock standard that we've got from games, if the characters are still clipping through surfaces, if animations are still wooden and like Starfield, for example, these are all things where, guessing the lighting can only take you so far. Mm-hmm. If you truly want photorealistic visuals, you need to lean more heavily into the simulation side of things. I think we saw that a bit with ray tracing to begin with, where the games would implement ray tracing, but then it kind of looked out of place because the rest of the game was not really designed for those visuals. So you got these really impressive lighting effects, but then the geometry, the textures were sort of still old school in a sort of way. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, from all those technical challenges, I mean, you can see why I sort of sitting here saying like, I'm not super excited about this until they sort of show that those are not going to be problems with the final version.
So not to make this about Digital Foundry or whatever, but in a way, those guys got absolutely torched. What do you think they did wrong with their video? Are you saying if you were given the opportunity to go have a look at this and do an early sort of preview video, you would have basically said, interesting technology, some interesting potential here, but ultimately I just don't think it looks very good right now. Is that more the approach you would have taken?
Well, I mean, that's my opinion. So I don't want to sort of suggest that Digital Foundry should just change their opinion. If they looked at it and thought it looked impressive, I'm not going to sit here and say, well, that's wrong. You should have had a different opinion. In terms of like Digital Foundry's coverage, I didn't really have too much of an issue with it. Mm-hmm. Like, again, like saying your opinion, that's fine. I think maybe where they sort of stumbled is, now that the reaction has been so negative, and I'm not saying that they should change their opinion based on the negative reaction, but I think if a lot of people are going to have a negative reaction to a technology, you probably want to be able to respond to those criticisms in a way that is in line with your opinion. So if you think it's good, but people are criticizing it, you'd want to have some sort of response to those things, those issues that people are bringing up. So if you thought, for example, that the faces in Resident Evil looked good, but a lot of people are saying it looks like AI slop, you'd probably want to have some sort of reasoning why you didn't think it looked like that. And I guess by publishing it before the general public were able to see the examples, they weren't really able to respond to that, or maybe they weren't able to predict that the reaction would be as negative as it was. I was certainly surprised by our poll where 80% of people thought it made the games look worse. I was expecting many more people to say it looked better than what we got in that poll.
Yeah, maybe 50-50. And this really does highlight the struggles we've had over the years and the criticism we've come up against. And just the general issues with testing these new technologies, like when we should be testing native versus with upscalers. Because for a long time, we sort of tried to hold out saying, native's king, show the native performance comparing these GPUs, and then we can have dedicated content pieces that focuses on upscaling. And we had heaps of pushback on that. We tried to do the native thing for a long time. We still, for GPU reviews, primarily focus on native, but we have like dedicated upscaling sections now just because there was a lot of requests for that, and we're obviously trying to make content for people who are buying this stuff and are interested in it. But just by nature, because it's so subjective, the ray tracing elements, the upscaling and all that, it's been so challenging and difficult to incorporate that into the reviews. And how much weight do we put on that? Because you'll have the crowd that's upscaling is an abomination, it's terrible, and then other people swear by it and it's a key feature. And if you don't have the best upscaling support, then what are you doing? So I guess that's in a way why I feel for them on this one, because I didn't think they did anything horrible in that content. Having watched it twice now, they just seemed passionate, excited about what they saw. And as they even explained in their follow-up thing, when you go and see these demos for the first time, and they probably didn't have expectations for seeing anything like that, and you walk in and you see this transformative technology, it blows you away a bit. I mean, even when we saw that AI demo at Computex for the first time.
Yeah, the AI voice demo that Nvidia had, which is called something that I forget. I'll put it on screen once I remember what it's called.
I forget. I think that probably impressed you and I more than we were expecting, though neither of us were terribly blown away by it. But as a tech demo, it's pretty neat. There was some pretty...
NVIDIA ACE.
Yeah, the NVIDIA ACE demo.
Talking about. Yep.
So, again, I was thinking about the future of gaming and what this could mean for gamers, and it was clearly that sort of thing is going to make future gaming way more interesting, more engaging, possibly more unique outcomes and things like that. And yeah, it was pretty exciting and stuff to see firsthand. Like, we weren't really expecting it to be probably as good as it was, though. You exposed some limitations in it pretty quickly, but anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, so I think the last thing I want to talk about with DLSS 5 is just the general reaction and how NVIDIA handled this launch, because I think largely they've handled it quite poorly. Obviously, the initial reactions were overwhelmingly negative. I was actually really surprised reading some of the threads on r/NVIDIA shortly after it was launched. Generally, they're more positive towards DLSS technologies on that particular Reddit, but even there were highly critical, I would say, of what NVIDIA has shown. So I find it a little bizarre that NVIDIA showed it in the way that they did, or at least didn't understand that the images and comparisons that they were showing would go down so badly with gamers. I guess maybe they didn't realize that the examples had this AI slop look to it. I'm not 100% sure. But I would be highly surprised if they expected the reaction that they got. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, logically, it makes sense that they expected it to go over much better than it did, because, they wouldn't have done it in the way they did. So I think they should go without saying, unless they're suckers for punishment.
Yeah, so I think some of the damage control that they were doing afterwards probably suggests that they weren't expecting the reaction. And I'm pointing to things like they quite quickly started stressing about the creative control angle for developers. That feels a little damage control-y to me. And then, Jensen coming out and saying that gamers were wrong to claim that the output looks bad. I mean, that's a pretty tone-deaf response in my opinion. I don't think you can really come out and sort of say, well, the gamers are wrong. The gamers had an opinion about this, that it looked bad, but they're wrong to have that opinion. Because ultimately, same with the DF stuff, it's an opinion. Like, you can't just be like, well, your opinion is wrong, because it's ultimately a subjective opinion about the visual look of the game. So, yeah, Jensen saying that I thought was, pretty tone deaf. Did you have any thoughts about his comments?
Not particularly. They didn't shock me or anything like that. I think it's on the consumer front, it's becoming increasingly difficult for NVIDIA for a whole number of reasons. Not just because their marketing has been, like I said, so weaponized on so many different fronts over the years, and people are waking up to the fact that a good amount of what they say is, how do I put it? Let's say BS. Again, the famous, 50/70 equals 40/90, and there's been endless other examples. So I think people are getting pretty sick of being lied to their faces and, being treated like they're idiots. And then there's the whole, AI thing on top of that as well, which is just a big old amount of salt in the wound on that one. So, yeah, I know we've seen Jensen cry, for a lack of a better term, about people hating on AI multiple times over the past few months. So this is just sort of a continuation of that. But I think they're in a position where they're just like, well, we're doing it anyway, and you'll like it. And you'll have no choice but to like it and whatever. So they're just going to push ahead with it. So we'll have to see how that all plays out.
Yeah, I think the generative AI angle is in terms of, people's, I guess, mixed to negative reactions about generative AI is going to be quite interesting to see how that plays out in the gaming space, because there's a lot of developers out there and artists working on games who are very anti-generative AI. And so there's going to be, unlike a technology like DLSS upscaling, which uses an AI model but is not generative AI, it is a machine learning system trained to do a specific task. It's going to be interesting to see what the adoption of this technology is like when you have a lot of that anti-AI sentiment among the actual developers creating games, who often see games as art. I don't want to get into the discussion too much about are games art or whatever, but certainly some developers have a very negative opinion of generative AI. They don't want to use it in games. And gamers themselves have a negative opinion of the use of generative AI for things like assets in games, textures, art that is used in titles. And there have been significant backlashes to games that have been found to be using this technology. And so that's going to create this really interesting scenario where DLSS 5 being a generative AI technology may not be adopted in the way that we've seen from these other standpoints based on the angle of generative AI is anti-art or whatever, or steals assets to train models or whatever the case is.
Yeah, the moral implications are the big one there, right? That's what a lot of people are upset about.
That's right. Like, you wouldn't have moral issues with DLSS upscaling's AI model, but developers have definite moral issue. Well, some of them at least do have moral issues with generative AI. So it's very, very different.
Yeah, don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but yeah, I completely understand that it's hugely problematic.
And again, I think the reaction might have been maybe less down that path if they had shown more of the developer control that they supposedly have for this model, or potentially, I don't think there's as much of these ethical issues with, for example, developers creating a whole bunch of art assets, putting that into some sort of generative model, and then using that to create more assets at the end of the day. I think that is largely seen as acceptable. So if that was something that DLSS 5 could do, then I think the reaction would have been quite different if they were sort of suggesting, well, developers can create the models of characters that they want and then put them into our DLSS 5 model and it would improve the lighting and things like that. I think that would be very different to having a system that was just more broadly trained. And from my understanding, DLSS 5 is a single model that is applicable across all games. It is not trained on a per game basis. It is one model that you can implement. And so, yeah, that I think there would have been a very different reaction if it had more of that ability to be only trained, for example, on the assets at a particular game studio or whatever. So, but anyway, those are certainly some interesting implications for DLSS 5 adoption in sort of the games that are coming out into the future. So, yeah, I'll be interested to learn a lot from developers about their opinions of this technology from that sense, because they're the people to listen to when it comes to that side of the implications. So, did you have any other final thoughts about DLSS 5 based on what you've seen, or should we talk a bit about Crimson Desert?
Yeah, we can move on and talk about a bit more about, talk about Crimson Desert, because we haven't talked about that at all, and move on from DLSS 5 because, yeah, it's probably something that I'm not going to have really an opinion on until we actually see a real-world implementation of it that we can test for ourselves, and then I'd be more comfortable forming an opinion at that point in time.
Crimson Desert, obviously the new game that has come out that is, I guess, one of the most popular titles in terms of hype and that sort of thing. I think Steam pre-orders have been through the roof on this particular game. It's been seen as one of the major titles released through this year, and we did get early access to take a look at the game on PC. Both you and I have had a look. By the time this podcast goes out, both of our videos will be out, so you'll be able to see the performance benchmarking as well as the graphics optimization side of things. It certainly is an interesting game visually. I think it generally looks great, and from what I understand from your performance testing, it also runs pretty well on most hardware.
Yep, definitely. Yeah, how well optimized the game is, I suppose that's going to be one of those things that's up for debate. I did struggle with that in the conclusion of my video, just because, yeah, it does run well on a range of hardware, but I found that the game had just an absolutely frustrating, and I certainly covered this and mentioned it in my conclusion, just an annoying amount of pop-in. I find pop-in, it's like up there with, screen tearing or, one of the other things. It's probably one of the more annoying things you can have happen in a game, and there's just boatloads of it on display in Crimson Desert. So I found that pretty frustrating. But then, the size of the world didn't really run into any traversal stutter or any issues like that. Not that I played a huge amount of it, but I played through it a bit.
I haven't. I've played much more of it than you have. Not heaps. I'm still very early in the game, but I haven't experienced any traversal stutter.
Yeah, and I was sitting there thinking, what is more annoying? Traversal stutter once every few minutes or just endless pop-in? It's like, honestly, I kind of want the traversal stutter if I can avoid the pop-in, because the pop-in...
Really? I'd go the other way.
I just find it breaks the immersion for me. It makes the game seem a bit sloppy, and it cheapens the graphics. And it's not absolutely terrible in all aspects of the game, but there's some sections you walk through and, mate, it's just like a spaghetti of graphics appearing and disappearing. And
it's bad on the horse.
I watched your video in full, so I've seen your optimization guide, which would be live by the time people listen to the podcast. So I watched it ahead of time, pre-release version. I got a private viewing, so that was nice. And yeah, the stuff you showed was real bad as well. Like, I was like, okay, it's not just the 40 GPUs that I tested or something with my system, because I was wondering, like, what the hell's going on here?
The noise issues in the game are pretty significant in indoor lighting. And I did sort of stress in my video that a lot of the time when you're outdoors, the noise isn't hugely problematic, but certainly when you're going into some of those indoor environments, there's a lot of, as I put it, rough edges to the graphics. It seems like
that's in addition to the pop-in, though.
That is in addition to the pop-in. It feels like the game is of such large scope, and there's so many environments, there's so many buildings that you can enter. The open world is so large that they haven't been able to solve all of these graphical problems. Like, they've wanted to crank up the grass detail to the max. They want to crank up the shadows. They want to crank up ray tracing, global illumination. And by doing all of that while getting the performance that they're able to achieve, they've sort of been like, well, pop in, can we solve that? Not really. Noise, we'll try get that nicely working in as many environments as we can, but obviously they can't go through and optimize every single environment, at least in the current version of the game, especially because it's all, it's dynamic real-time lighting, which is the most difficult to optimize. And so, the noise issues, they're not great. Certainly, even playing on maximum sort of settings, ray reconstruction does do a great job of fixing a lot of the problems, but the base version of the game, I think a lot of people will be playing because of how taxing ray reconstruction is. You will see noise issues, unfortunately. And then there's obviously some things that I personally believe are bugs and should be fixable. So, the detail blur issues with using upscaling, and, I think ray reconstruction deletes rain, for example. These sorts of things I think should be relatively easily fixed. And that, I think, will go a long way to improving that side of things. Like, the noise is bad, but I think they will be able to optimize that through some patches. But then again, we've seen games more like, another noisy game that comes to mind is Stalker 2. And despite a large number of patches, that game remains quite noisy today. So it's not always possible.
Playing the game to the extent that I did, while I did notice the noise, and it was a bit disappointing, I could ignore that. It was the pop-in that annoyed the hell out of me.
Okay, it was the reverse for me for sure.
Oh,
I
okay.
noticed the lighting noise more than the pop-in.
Yeah. If I only really noticed that if I stopped and looked at things, and then it became really apparent, like, have I got like some sort of broken upscaling technology enabled here or something? Like, what's with all the noise? But no, for me, it was the pop-in that was the most annoying thing by a country mile. If they could even reduce that by half, the game would be much more enjoyable for me. Yeah, it was real. It's pretty bad. Like, I didn't want to go too hard in my initial video because I just wasn't convinced it was as bad as I thought it was. But then when I see other people playing the game, other people's feedback, I saw your testing. I'm like, no, the pop-in's as bad as I think it is. Like, it's not. Anyway, I mentioned it multiple times in my video. I wasn't super happy with it, and I was interested to see what people thought, whether it was a non-issue or not as bad as I thought. But yeah, a lot of people thought it was as bad or worse than what I let on in my content. So, but that aside, the game itself looks like, if you're into that style of game, it's a very good game.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the environment quality, like if there weren't those issues, the environments that they've been able to create are really breathtaking and beautiful. There's a lot of amazing looking scenes in it. And then, yeah, there's a large number of things you can do in the game. Many, many, many systems, some of which I haven't even gotten close to. I was reading some of the thoughts from there was a Crimson Desert pre-release server on Discord where you could bring up bugs and issues and that sort of thing. And people were talking about systems later in the game that I'd never even run into in the parts that I gotten up to, and things sound like they get pretty crazy in that sense. So yeah, I think people they'll have a lot of fun playing it from that sense. My understanding is, reading the reviews this morning, is that the story is not particularly amazing. So, but then again, there's been games like, I don't know, Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom. Those games have, in my opinion, non-existent bad levels of story, but you can still enjoy them from the gameplay mechanics and visuals and exploration side of things, which is certainly, even though I agree the parts of the game I've played so far have got very little story in them to get excited about, I'm really enjoying the mechanics, the combat, the exploration angle to it. In addition to that, there are some interesting technical things with the game. The first one is that the game does not launch on Intel Arc GPUs at all. So unfortunately, if you have a B580 or something like that, you can't run the game. It's not like it crashes. There is a pop-up saying the game is not supported on Intel GPUs. There's no support for XeSS or any Intel-specific features either. So currently, unfortunately, Intel owners are left out, but maybe with future patches or Intel drivers, they'll be able to work with the developers to get it working. But because this, I guess, is not a widely used game engine, they're sort of running into that. Is that what you would have sort of used as the reasoning for why it doesn't work?
I guess so. It is a bit odd. I would have thought a company as large as Intel and a game as large as Crimson Desert, especially with the hype around that, and plenty of Intel. Well, there's some Intel Arc users out there. They would,
especially on laptops.
Yeah, they would have. Yeah, that's right. They would have gotten contact and worked that out well ahead of release. But I mean, there's also the AMD driver angle as well. Like, a lot of people are upset that we've released our content. Saying that there'll be a day one driver from AMD that will presumably enhance performance. I am highly skeptical as to whether or not that'll happen. Basically, simply because this is an AMD sponsored title. AMD should have already had the driver out by now. They knew that there was people reviewing the game and testing the game ahead of the actual official release, and we got no word from them about drivers. So
yeah, and a bit more context with this as well. I think there's this idea that the day one driver, the game ready driver or whatever, immediately adds all of the performance fixes and improvements at that exact moment that the driver is released. Like, I think there's this perception that pre the day one driver, absolutely no optimization. The game was going to run like garbage. It's completely unsupported. Then the day one driver is released. It supports the game. That's generally not how it works, at least is my understanding, that the developers and the driver developers and the game developers work together to introduce fixes over time, because of course the developers themselves, they're developing the game. So they're doing this on PC hardware, and so they need the game to work as well. And so over time, you get these fixes bundled in the background, and then eventually it comes to this point where either AMD or Nvidia goes, hey, we're good now, we're calling this the day one driver. So for reference, the developers Pearl Abyss recommend the following drivers as having the best experience for running this game. So they recommend AMD driver version 25.9.2 and Nvidia driver version 581.29. This is from the review guide. Both of these drivers, I believe, are from September of last year, so they're almost 6 months old. Those are the recommended drivers for testing the game. And from my understanding, reading some of the bug fixes and bug reports that they've made in that Discord server, some of the drivers released in between that driver and the release driver introduced problems that aren't there if you roll back to the recommended driver that the developers have been, I guess, testing the game on. So this isn't necessarily a case where, again, it's like broken and then suddenly it works. The developers recommended a driver from 6 months ago to test the game with. And my understanding is the current NVIDIA drivers do work quite well with this game and have resolved some of the problems that were there with intermediary drivers. But certainly the developers recommend a driver that's old, even for NVIDIA. So yeah, these optimizations, I would not be expecting big performance improvements with the day one NVIDIA AMD driver.
Yeah, in this specific example, I absolutely would not be expecting that. Of course, there have been examples in the past where a driver has addressed, performance-related issues, and sometimes they've been substantial.
Or bug fixes.
Yeah, or bug fixes, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's even a common thing. And yeah, again, in this specific example, being an AMD-sponsored title, and AMD have had plenty of input with the game and stuff, it would just be weird that there's a driver that drops tomorrow that boosts performance by 10%, let's say. Anyway, we'll see on that one.
The AMD results aren't even, I would say, like crazy or anything.
Probably
like they're within.
Yeah, for a title with ray tracing enabled and all that sort of stuff, I think they're probably roughly where you'd expect. They're just a bit disappointing when you compare, say, like the 9060 XT versus the 5060 Ti, and it ends up more like a 5060, which is definitely underperforming based on sort of your average expected performance.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's not like the performance is fully broken on these GPUs. It's just a bit underwhelming.
Yep.
And I mean, at least from the feature side of things, like FSR, that sort of thing, those all work in the game. The ray regeneration feature from AMD seems to work as well, similar to how it works in Call of Duty, the first game that had that. So it's not like these technologies are going to be added in with the day one driver either. Those technologies are integrated into the game and from what I can see work as expected. There's no crazy AMD, like things aren't working well. Maybe the performance of things like ray regeneration was a bit disappointing given that it's a Redstone title and an AMD quote unquote sponsored game. But it certainly isn't anything that's unexpected. So, it is what it is from that sense. The game also has great HDR, in my opinion. I've played a fair bit of it on a QD-OLED monitor and looks really nice in HDR. Nice pure blacks, high peak brightness, so you sort of get quite a contrasty look in a lot of scenes, unlike some PC games. So I think if you've got an HDR screen, you'll be able to enjoy the full graphics that this game has to offer, which is quite nice because we have seen some AAA titles launch even without HDR support natively. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, for example, did not launch with HDR support. Crimson Desert's HDR implementation is much better than what you saw from that game. So from that sense, that's another nice sort of technical aspect that we saw that was, I guess, a good feature of Crimson Desert. I'm really interested to see how, the general reception from gamers once they get their hands on this, whether they notice some of the graphical issues and flaws that we sort of saw, whether they think that is a deal breaker. But I don't think it's on the level of, we sort of saw all that criticism of Cyberpunk 2077 running on consoles where there was like T-posing and, game worlds not loading in because of asset streaming issues. That doesn't seem to be the case with Crimson Desert. So I would expect it to run quite well on base console hardware. Not that I've seen that. But yeah, certainly for lower spec gamers, there's a nice amount of stuff in here that it should run and look reasonable on quite modest hardware. So that's always quite nice from that sense. So
yeah, and at least in my testing, which, you know, I spent several days testing 40 GPUs, didn't have a single crash, no like glitches or hitches to speak of in that sense. Game loaded up fine every time. And yeah, no problems at all. So that's pretty rare that across, you know, a wide range of Radeon and GeForce GPUs, there's no problems when using, you know, various different models, quality settings, resolutions, all that sort of stuff. So I was really happy with that. It was a pleasure to test the game in that sense.
Shader compilation doesn't take too long, at least on a 9800X3D, so that's reasonably fast. You can change the vast majority of the settings without having to restart the game. You get the graphics changes instantly, so that is another positive for the title. So there's, of course, some bugs and stuff. Sometimes you switch things to certain things and it can do weird graphic stuff, pre-release versions of games. My understanding is more the bugs, there are sort of more like progression-related bugs, quest bugs, system mechanic type bugs in the game. So you may run into those later on in the title. I saw some people complaining that there were progression-related issues, but we tested a pre-release version of the game as well. There's apparently a day one patch coming and a post-launch patch in the weeks after that are going to start addressing quite a lot of the feedback that was placed in there. So I would expect things like the DLSS bug, the texture bug that we sort of talked about to be addressed, as well as a lot of those issues. So yeah, I think unfortunately though, the pop-in issue and some of the noise is probably more engine related. So I'm not expecting like huge improvements there, but it would be nice if they could. So
do you think that's a result of them trying to make the game playable on 8 gigabytes of VRAM, for example? Or do you think it's just down to the limitations of the engine?
I don't think the lighting system is related to 8 gigabytes of VRAM. I certainly think the pop-in is, and some of the texture quality that you pointed out, like even if you're in that sort of, because the way the game works is it has an area around your character that loads in sort of the high detail mode, and then beyond that is sort of the lower detail mode. And as you move around, as things enter that high detail zone, they pop in. That causes most of the pop in. And I think that, yes, they've probably made that draw distance relatively close so that it's not an issue on 8 gigabytes of VRAM. But even then, like some of the textures that you see looking close up at some of the rocks and things like that, the texture quality isn't amazing up close relative to other titles that we've seen. I think it looks great from a distance. So the texture quality that you see on a really far away mountain or rock or tree looks great. I'm assuming because they're loading in a low quality but still decent quality texture for those assets. But then the flaws do get exposed a bit when you're looking at the closer up assets. I think that's where they probably could have benefited from increasing texture quality and increasing draw distance for those with more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. But it certainly can also use more than 8 gigabytes anyway. If you're playing the game at 4K with something like ray reconstruction enabled at 4K native, you can easily be using up to 10 gigabytes, maybe a little over 10 gigabytes with frame generation. So it's not a game where I would say you're guaranteed to be able to run it within 8 gigabytes. There are definitely configurations where it goes over. So that'll probably do us for Crimson Desert. I don't think we have too much more to say about that particular game, but as I said, interested in the feedback that people will have. I think for now, we'll take a break, come back and talk about our boring lives. All right, and we're back. As you might be able to tell from my voice throughout this podcast, maybe even Steve's voice, I'm still feeling the lingering effects of my cold. So I don't think we'll be spending too much time in this segment, in this podcast episode, especially because I've spent most of my time either trying to recover from that or testing Crimson Desert, or even just because I've got a baby on the way doing stuff related to that. So yeah, my life hasn't been too exciting lately from that sense. Did get out and do some mowing recently. I've sort of enjoyed the Adelaide Crows' first win of the AFL season against Collingwood last weekend. That was nice to see. But outside of those sorts of things, I haven't been doing all that much. Maybe eventually I'll talk more about my thoughts of Crimson Desert, the game, as opposed to Crimson Desert, the technical PC showcase. But I'll need to play a lot more of the game to sort of get into that. So no real thoughts on that for now. And yeah, nothing else too much has been happening in my life. So what about you? Anything exciting over your way?
Well, surprise, surprise. My life's been similar to your life. So we last spoke on Friday, if I recall correctly. And Saturday, you got early access added to my Steam account. So I spent a good portion of Saturday playing the game, working out how and where I was going to test the game and what settings were appropriate to test with. So that probably took up more than half the day, and that was my weekend. And then I spent the rest of Saturday doing some Intel-related testing and updating and trying to stay on top of all of that for upcoming content. So basically, I just worked a very long Saturday shift, woke up Sunday morning and got into the testing, all the benchmarking, and I pretty much did that nonstop up until you just about saw the video. So from the time I spoke to you last, I've done nothing but work at the computer. Pretty typical standard stuff. Nothing additionally boring beyond that, I'm afraid. Oh, I lie. On Sunday, I thought, you know what? I'm not going to spend 3-4 days just testing the exact same section of this game without break. I did watch the football game, Melbourne and St Kilda, on Sunday afternoon. So, and I was going to watch it at my computer while I benchmarked. I thought, no, I'm going to enjoy this. I'm going to just sit back and just watch the football. So I went into the gym and I watched the game. At halftime, I did a brief workout and then I finished watching the game. And of course, Melbourne won by 2 goals. So I was very happy with that.
Yes, I saw the end of that match and it seemed like it was quite close. So
it was a really good game.
Yeah, good for Melbourne to get off to a win in the season. We'll see how they go throughout the year. But yeah, it's been, I guess, a good start for both of our teams. So that's always nice. And the season's just getting started, so plenty more of that to come. I guess that pretty much does it for this week's podcast episode. If you're interested in more Hardware Unboxed content, you want to support us, Patreon is always the answer to that. If you sign up, you get access to the ad-free version of this podcast. We've got a feed for supporters that you get access to. The podcast also usually goes up a little bit earlier on that feed if you're interested, plus all the usual stuff, our Discord community, monthly live streams, and behind-the-scenes content. Not sure what's going to be happening to the podcast next week because I could be welcoming a baby instead of doing a podcast, so we're just going to play that one by ear. But if things happen and I'm not around for a little while, we'll see you later. But we'll see what happens on that front. But until then, thanks for listening to this episode. Thanks for watching if you're watching on YouTube, and we'll catch you in the next one.